ask my students, so why have we spent 4 days on this topic? What can we do with this knowledge going forward? And so we talk about recognizing other genocides. We talk about this, how this framework was developed. We talk about the pyramid of systematic hatred. And so we talk about how their words have impact.
That's Callaway County High School social studies teacher Lane Springer. She's also one of the assistant directors for the University of Kentucky's JHF Holocaust Education Initiative. The program trains teachers around the state to ethically and responsibly teach students about a really difficult topic. Last week, Springer hosted one of those trainings at the high school in Murray called Teaching the Holocaust 101. This week on the Crossroads Suncast, how learning about 1930s Germany helps students to better understand American history, and what that teaches us about being better neighbors and citizens. I'm Bryce Patterson. Springer says she found the program initially because there was a real need for her.
It was my first year teaching in the 2021-2022 school year. And I had struggled with my US history class, feeling like I had adequate knowledge and resources to teach this difficult subject. I mean, a few others too, but especially the Holocaust, because our textbook gives a very kind of general overview, and I think this is quite common. And it doesn't highlight any kind of nuanced story of survivors. It doesn't really provide a lot of good primary sources, which tend to uh, like pull students into the content a little bit more. And it didn't have anything about America's role in the Holocaust. And I always have students ask, well, how much did Americans know? Or what was America doing during the Holocaust? Not so much like they usually understand more about what America was doing in World War II, but what was America doing in the Holocaust? And I felt ill equipped to answer those questions. I didn't know where to look, and so I thought it was perfect timing that this application came in at the end of my first year teaching. And so I applied. I was very happy to be accepted. I was the only teacher in the Jackson Purchase region the first year, and I've been with it ever since.
So the first question, how are teachers learning to approach the topic?
So there's two things that every workshop has to include. That's the guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust that are set by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So we always kind of walk our students through that, or excuse me, not our students, our teachers through that, because it gives such a good baseline for what to do. So balancing the perspectives, right? Talking about um, we don't want to do role playing exercises with like difficult topics in history. We want to translate statistics. So the 6 million people that were murdered in this genocide into stories that students can relate to. These are a couple of different guidelines. So we always walk our teachers through those guidelines because I didn't know those guidelines when I was first teaching. I didn't know about them until I started with this program through UK. And so that's the first thing that's included in every workshop. The second thing is including survivor stories. We have an excellent source of Holocaust survivor stories who immigrated to Kentucky. And so it's a book called This Is Home Now by Arwen Donahue. And there's 9 survivor testimonies in it of people who immigrated to Kentucky. And it's just a wonderful way for students to have a local connection to this big global event. So we highlight both of those things. And then in terms of the rest of planning a workshop, it depends on what our teacher leaders feel compelled to include in their sessions. I mean, you have, I would say, around 8 to 10 sessions in a workshop. And so I just went over 2 of them that they have to talk about. But, you might have an English language arts teacher who really wants to talk about Maus and other graphic novels. You might have a history teacher like myself who wants to talk about America's role in the Holocaust. You might have an art teacher who wants to talk about artistic representations of the Holocaust. And so it varies based on what the teacher specializes in, but also what they think their district needs. So, for instance, at the Murray workshop, ours was titled Teaching the Holocaust 101, and we wanted to give a basic overview of if we were talking to teachers who had had no kind of specialized training in the Holocaust. Okay, what are the basics that you need to know? So we had a professor from UK talk about responsible media depiction. So if you're choosing to pick a movie there's some responsible choices that need to be made. We had a teacher from McCracken County, Crystal Culp, who talked about photo analysis and how you pick photos for that. I talked about myths and misconceptions of the Holocaust. And so um, that's just one example. Every single workshop is unique, other than the fact that everybody goes over the guidelines and uses survivor stories.
So talk to me a little bit about, you've mentioned survivor stories and just storytelling in general. What is the role of storytelling in communicating this?
So I use two survivor testimonies from Kentucky survivors. One is Alice Goldstein and one is Sylvia Green. And I use them because it makes it a little bit more real for students because there's a Kentucky connection. So they're like, oh, this is somebody from my state, right? This isn't somebody that, um, lives a world away. Like they live in the world that I know. And then also, it's important to hear firsthand from these people, as you said, storytelling, because I mean, as we get further and further from the Holocaust, we're losing that living link to those experiences. So survivor testimonies are really important way to, you know, do justice to these people's stories. So Alice Goldstein, she grew up in Germany and she survived. She's still living and she still speaks to students as well. And she survived Kristallnacht and then her family was able to immigrate to America. And so there's an excellent interview that she's done that was reported through the University of Kentucky's Oral History Center, where she talks about, the lead up in Germany to Hitler coming to power and all of the Nuremberg laws and how their rights were stripped away at different stages, and it helps students understand all of the different moving parts, that the Holocaust didn't begin with camps. It began with laws and the stripping away of basic rights and, their citizenship rights. And so I use her testimony when I talk about Kristallnacht and the Nuremberg laws, and it really just solidifies, I think, student understanding of what I show them in a PowerPoint versus what a person who lived through when she's speaking her story. And then I also use Sylvia Green's testimony on the last day of my Holocaust unit. So she survived Auschwitz and immigrated to Winchester, Kentucky. And she didn't speak about her story, like what she went through until the 80s when a teacher in Lexington was openly teaching Holocaust denial as truth in his classroom. And so then she and other local survivors started speaking out. And so I give this example to students. They're usually like baffled at that a teacher would say, oh, the Holocaust didn't have, Holocaust denial is being taught in a classroom. Um, it helps students understand that this why we're talking about Holocaust education, why it's important to continue this story because you still come across even to this day barriers. So they see that, oh, okay, like some of the issues of the Holocaust continue to the 80s, and then we talk about what we see in the modern world too. And so these two stories have always stood out to me as soon as I learned about them in 2022, and I think it's just an excellent way for students to really try to understand and maybe empathize with people who have a very different lived experience than them.
Have you found that through these trainings and through this framework, has it helped you to talk more about American history or to better teach some of those, like, darker points in US history?
I think so because all of the training that we go through for UKJHF, it's all centered around trauma informed pedagogical practices and inquiry based content. And so we're trying to get students to ask deeper questions because that's another guideline. Like, don't have simplistic answers to really complicated questions. And you want higher levels of thinking with content like this. So it absolutely has helped when I talk in US history, let's say, about Jim Crow era South or about, really any kind of like war atrocity that we come across in whatever war that you're looking at. Um, all these different things. And it made me really think about, you need to know your students and have those connections in place with them even at the beginning of the year. So when you get to these difficult topics, you can anticipate what might trigger something in a student because it's important to recognize that. I mean, you want to convey just how important it is to learn about this information, but without further traumatizing a student. So it's been integral to my pedagogy and my curriculum development. um, like in all areas. I also teach sociology, and so especially in that class as well. So sociology, U.S. history. Um, so I think just knowing your students, making those connections, being aware of like how might they respond to this. And so, for instance, one of the things that I don't show are like very graphic images, especially of like the camps and the survivors, because it's not needed. Because if you look at the primary sources and the stories, they have all that detail in there. And it's slightly less, trauma inducing than perhaps a graphic image. And so that's something that I kind of learned about because I grew up being shown a lot of different images in the classroom. And I don't necessarily, I'm not blaming my teachers. I think it shows that this pedagogical training is needed because if you haven't really been through something like this program, it might not be your default to think about that.
One of the stated goals of the initiative: helping teachers to ethically teach about the Holocaust. Here's what that means to Springer.
You wanna convey the gravity of this content, you wanna do justice to its victims and its survivors, but in a way that is helpful for moving forward as these students who are about to become members of a society, not something that's gonna make them further dwell on maybe their own traumas. And so, talking about, all right, how do we learn from these stories? One thing that I talk about is, the term genocide was created to define the crime of the Holocaust because it was such a unique thing in history at the time. I'm created by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. And we talk about, okay, like I asked my students, so why have we spent 4 days on this topic? Why have we talked about this? What can we do with this knowledge going forward? And so we talk about recognizing other genocides. We talk about this, how this framework was developed. We talk about the pyramid of systematic hatred, where the bottom layer is othering, and then it gets to slurs, and then it gets to bias motivated violence, and then eventually killing and extermination. And so we talk about how their words have impact. And to me, that this is the ethical training, like getting them to think this happened, this genocide happened in stages. And we also talk about, bystanders versus upstanders because there were more bystanders in the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't just happen because of like one leader, it was his whole network. It was ordinary people who stood by and watched these things happen. And we talk about the very small fraction of upstanders who made a stand and either tried to help a Jewish person or they made a stand by speaking out against some of these policies. And so to me, that is teaching the Holocaust ethically and responsibly, trying to get them to see, like, I'm not just teaching this because there's a mandate and because there's a standard, but because there's an important lesson here in moving forward as a society and I think members of society and not spreading hate and not spreading discrimination.
I'm trying to form a question here because I think, right now there's just a huge kind of national conversation around anti-Semitism. It's been a major topic for the last couple of years. And I guess I'm interested, is that something that you find is coming up in the classroom? Is that context kind of impacting? How do you feel that context around you, I guess?
Yeah, so I end my Holocaust talking about why it's still such an important um, issue and how anti-Semitism is unfortunately on the rise. And we talk about like especially post-COVID, like there was a large spike. We talk about how this is what one of our professors has instilled in like the teacher leaders. I love this phrase. She talks about how because I think it really hits home why this work is important. Anti-Semitism is not bookended by the Holocaust. It didn't begin with the Holocaust, and it unfortunately has not ended with the Holocaust. And so I talk to my students about that because they do come to me with things they see on social media, things they see in TikTok. And I'm glad that I've built conversation or connections to where they feel comfortable to ask me questions about content they see. Because if they're confused, they're gonna ask, like, what is this that I'm seeing? And so, you know, conversations do arise because there's, you know, issues of Nazi symbols that they see in the world. There's issues of stereotypes that come up, and so we have conversations about those things. And I make it clear about like how we can discuss these things, but I draw a very hard line on if there's any behavior if it happens in the classroom of like let's say, a student drawing a swastika or making a snide comment because they don't understand the gravity of it. And so I think part of it is, again, making students understand that their work have impact and whether they want to admit it or not, certain things that might be said, um, like have a really deep seated and problematic meaning when it comes to anti-Semitism. So we do have conversations about these things because they do come up in the world that they live in, unfortunately.
So I'm interested in how parents or families might be able to draw on this from the kind of training that you've done. Is there a framework or a way that parents can approach these conversations if these kinds of things come up?
I think that's a great question. And I saw in your email and I was like, I've never really thought about that. But I think it's an important avenue to really kind of explore because a lot of a lot of learning happens in the home from parents, right? They're their kids' first teacher. And I would say a great resource is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because they have an entire Holocaust encyclopedia website. And it really can help with your context of understanding this very difficult, very complicated, very nuanced subject, which is why it's so difficult to teach because there's a lot to it. And so I would say that's a great starting point. For Kentucky parents, I would recommend reading This Is Home Now, um, Kentucky's Holocaust Survivor Speak by Arwen Donahue, because it's such a great local connection um, to this global event. And so those are my first two kind of suggestions. I wonder because our workshops are geared towards teachers. And so I wonder if then talking with our teacher leaders about making more, maybe more direct conversations with parents, or like at least letting them know that they can ask them questions about things that they see. I think it's a great question. I unfortunately just don't have, I think, a great answer for it.
My last question. As a teacher, what does you wish people knew or understood about the Holocaust?
This goes into really any kind of historical inquiry. Um, there's really no simple answers. History is quite complex, especially when you start digging deeper and narrowing in on a subject. Like, there's just not simple answers to big questions. And that's what students tend to want. I think it's probably also what parents tend to want that aren't in education, just because, I mean, it's outside both of their purviews and it's easier, but there aren't simple answers or simplistic answers with difficult subjects in history. And so I wish that I think people kind of knew that and were willing to explore their own learning further with that. In terms of the Holocaust, more specifically, I usually get students who come in very intent on learning just about Hitler, and the Holocaust is not just about Hitler. I mean, of course, he's a key component of it, but it is bigger than just one man. And I would say that. And I would say that I wish that students in the general public knew about America's role in some of the things. And I think it's slowly becoming more widespread. But, this is something I struggled with as a first year teacher because I don't ever remember being formally taught anything about America's role in the Holocaust, right? It happened an ocean away. But there were a lot of things that were happening here that contributed to anti Semitism, that contributed to Jewish refugees not being able to come into America because of immigration laws. There were very strict immigration quotas at this time that were developed in the 1920s. It was very, very difficult for people to immigrate to America, also Canada at this time. And many visas were denied. There were many steps that you had to go through to even get to a point where you could get like an interview to potentially come to the United States. And there's a great lesson plan through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that I use that goes through each step. So, like, one of them would be that like a German Jewish citizen, for instance, would have to go to their local police department and get like a signed waiver that they weren't going to be like a danger or a threat to the country they were moving in. Well, if you live under a Nazi regime that's stripping away your basic rights, it's going to be difficult potentially to get somebody to sign off on that. You also had to have a sponsor from somebody in America. And if you didn't know anybody in America, that could be extremely difficult. They also had to like financially vouch for you that you wouldn't be a drain on the system. And so there's all these barriers in place. And the there's getting students to understand just how difficult it was for a Jewish person to immigrate out of Nazi Germany at the time is a really kind of meaningful lesson plan, because I usually always have one student ask, well, why didn't they just leave? Many tried. Some were successful, most were not. And that's one barrier. I also have a gallery walk that I created about American upstanders. So people who spoke out, Americans who spoke out and chose to do something. One of my favorites to talk about is a woman named Dorothy Thompson. She was an American journalist based in Munich. She was, I think, one, if not the first, but one of the first American journalists to interview Hitler after he came to power. And she like openly critiqued him, and she got kicked out of Germany. And she came back to America. She was a very like openly vocal opponent of fascism, totalitarianism, as she continued speaking out. There was a pro-Nazi rally in New York City in the 30s, and she went and she openly heckled the American Nazis that were speaking, to the point where she got kicked out. And she wrote and wrote all through the Holocaust and and World War II, calling out their actions. And so we talk about, all right, what were the risks and benefits of her doing this? Like ultimately, like what character strengths do we see in her? And I always like she's always, I think, a favorite for my students to learn about. So this was the first year that I developed that lesson. We talk about that. We talk about the parallels to Jim Crow laws and Nazism. We talk about African American newspapers who were speaking out as early as the 30s about the similarities that they were seeing between Jim Crow laws and what the Nazis were doing with the Nuremberg laws against Jewish people and other marginalized groups, but mostly Jewish people. So my entire unit is surrounded or is encompassed by things I've learned through this program. And um, it complicates my students' understanding. But that's what we want. We want them asking these big questions. We want them going through inquiry-based content, right? That's a higher tiered level of thinking. And so those are the things that I highlight in my American history unit.
This summer, a workshop in Berea will explore the intertwined history of the Holocaust and African American history in Kentucky. It's one of 10 trainings that the University of Kentucky is hosting for teachers across the state this year. If you or a teacher you know might be interested, you can find the details on the University of Kentucky's website. If there's a story you'd like us to cover on the Crossroads Suncast, shoot us an email at newstip@wpsdlocal6.com.